and I was like crazy, and I jumped over with my net, and I just landed on top of a thorny plant, but I was so happy because I catch it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BioBlitz Oklahoma podcast. I am Priscilla Crawford, co-coordinator of BioBlitz Oklahoma and a conservation biologist with the Oklahoma Biological Survey. I co-host this podcast with Angelina Stancampiano, Oklahoma State Park Senior Naturalist Coordinator. This podcast is an extension of our BioBlitz Oklahoma events. Now we can celebrate Oklahoma's biodiversity with you all year round. In this Meet the Expert episode, I chat with bee expert José Montalva. I have learned so much from talking with Jose about bees. He led the virtual field trip last summer during our pollinator week. I hope this podcast can distract you from the blast of winter we've been experiencing, and that our conversation has you dreaming about warm spring days, buzzing bees, and flower pollination.
My name is José Montalva. I'm currently a student of geography in the Oklahoma University with Dr. Bruce Hoagland. Also, I'm an instructor at East Central University here in Ada, Oklahoma. I teach biology, zoology, and geography. I'm a member of the Bumblebee Conservation for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the UECN.
Well, welcome, Jose, to our BioBlitz Oklahoma podcast. I'm so glad to have you on. You might not remember, but we met a couple years ago over Twitter. I had just started using Twitter, and I was posting about the pollinator meadow we had installed at the University of Oklahoma's biological station down at Lake Texoma. I think you saw my tweets about pollinators and bees, and you let me know that you were at East Central up in Ada, and that you had a bee collection, and that you were a bee expert that we could utilize for the class. I had no idea at the time that we had a bee expert in Oklahoma, and I was super excited to hear about you. And I was really hoping to have you visit our meadow and come down to our class at the biological station. But of course, the next year was our COVID problem. However, some of our super BioBlitz nerds listening to this podcast will remember that you led us on a virtual field trip last year during Pollinator Week during the summer in June. At the time, you were in the middle of a native bee survey at the Oklahoma City Zoo. You don't normally think about zoos as being interested in populations of insects or native species that are on their grounds. Why did the zoo start this project?
Before, like you mentioned, 2, maybe 3 years ago, I was just starting. We just moved here because my wife have this position as professor in East Central University. At that time, when we moved in this area, there is the Nature Conservancy. They was interested in studying the pollinators on the Nature Conservancy, and at that time, the person in charge invited me to study the bees in the Okayanali is a new park over there, preserve, and in Pontotoc was an older one, and we started identifying the bees, especially because in southern Oklahoma there are these prairies where they have a lot of change in the plants. They have different pollinators. And then I discovered that Oklahoma didn't have so much history about their pollinators, especially bees. There was not many surveys or not many information about what we have here. Jumping like 2 years ahead, I just started doing this master I mentioned here in Oklahoma University. And then Dr. Hoagland, they have many connections. And he was talking with the people of the Oklahoma City Zoo because they have many programs associated with pollinators that are trying to investigate what the pollinators are. At that moment was like late 2019. Dr. Rebecca Snyder from the Oklahoma City Zoo, they told me if I can write a project for studying the bees, especially in the butterfly garden, because they believe they have good diversity there. And they was trying to compare now to other projects because they will do a reforestation or do some more pollinator gardens, and then they will look if this get a better habitat for this. starting in 2020, and we didn't know if the project will go on because the coronavirus pandemic. But luckily for us, the project continued and we studied the bees. We worked for 2 months when the zoo was closed, and was kind of interesting because it was the zoo only for us.
Oh, that's neat.
And then it was interesting too because when we go into the zoo, we look at the animals, and the animals kind of doesn't care. But at that moment when I was alone, all the animals was looking at me. And like they was expecting for people, and I was the only one there. And they was like more interesting in the people.
I had heard that zoos were having a problem because the zoo animals were really used to having people around, and when the zoos closed down, they were getting bored.
Yeah, I experienced that. I see it like when normal we go to the zoo, we was like with my daughters, we was looking the lions, and the lions are always sleeping, or other animals are hidden in their boxes or in their little houses. In this case, when there was these 2 months, every time I go there and then they came to me and look at me, that was like a really different experience for sure.
Well, so what were some of the surprising findings that you discovered doing these surveys at the zoo?
At first, when we are thinking in cities, most of the time we think in low diversity because it's more urbanized and more fragmentation of the habitat, and we can find less places where animals or other species can have suitable environments. But at the zoo, in our survey, we found 60 species of bees. That was more than the preserves of the Okayanali and Pontotoc.
Oh, wow.
And that we found like 50, and here we found 60 species. The other thing got in the news, we found some species we consider extirpated here in Oklahoma. Historically, we supposed to have like 10 species of bumblebees. There was a study by Dr. Berge and Dr. Figueroa in 2015. They studied the bumblebees on Oklahoma, and historically it was 10, and then decreased the number of species to 4 species. At the zoo, we found the 4 species this study mentioned, but also we found 2 species that was considered extirpated. That was a kind of a good news.
Yeah.
This reservoir in middle of the city, they give habitat for species that are considered vulnerable.
So some of our listeners might not know the term extirpated. So extirpated is a term we use in biology or ecology when we say that a species is not in the area anymore. It's not extinct. It can be found in other places, but you could say that a species is extirpated from central Oklahoma, meaning that it hasn't been found there for years and years and years, but it can be found in other parts of its range. Some people use the term locally extinct, but that's not technically correct. So extirpated is a better term to use. So you're saying that some of these bees Berge and Figueroa found were extirpated from this region of Oklahoma, but that you were able to find them at the zoo?
Yep. We found 2 species. One is the 2-spotted bumblebee, and the other was the black and golden bumblebee, and it was present at the zoo.
So do you think that the reason why there were more species of more species of bees in general at the zoo versus these nature conservancy preserves, do you think that has something to do with kind of the diversity of the plantings that people put in, and that the habitat was kind of built by people?
I'm originally from Chile, and I did a study, the same idea, looking in the cities, they have less bees, and more diversity is when you have more places like more natural. And in Chile, I did something similar in the zoo in Chile. We was expecting to have less bees. In that case, we have a study that was made in 1920, and they have a list of species. And when we do the same study, we found more species in the same area. What will happen is the cities are kind of green oases. They get the space for these bees. It's like they are shrinking to these oases, and for this reason, we have more species, but at the same time, as they are moving to the last resources they can find.
Oh.
And probably this is happening for example, in the Oklahoma City Zoo or other places when before the bees, they have all this land with all the flowers, but now these flowers are not there anymore. They are moving to places where they can find it.
So the fact that you found more species at the zoo may not necessarily be a positive thing.
Yeah, probably is if we do genetic studies, maybe all these are related and then probably be not good for them.
Yeah, habitat fragmentation is becoming the biggest problem for species across the continent and across the world. Just the reduction of habitat and then the breaking up of the habitat. Yeah, I was kind of hoping that maybe it's because of the variety of zoo plantings that would encourage greater diversity.
The zoo have these really good programs now, especially the Oklahoma City Zoo, reforesting with more native plants. They have this butterfly garden where they have more native plants, and these attract native pollinators. And the zoo have this program where they give like grant to schools in the area for plant pollinator gardens. We have the problem of fragmentation, and it's not fixable because our cities are growing. But if we create these patches of plants, the patches will allow connectivity of them, and we can solve that idea of the problem of the genetic diversity. If there are enough patches of these wild flowers, the bees can fly to these patches and distribute it even in the cities.
Yeah, that's a kind of project that I have been trying to promote over the last couple of years is how easily you can add pollinator habitat to urban areas. And a lot of people are working on this pollinator patch projects and how easy it is to improve pollinator habitat in urban areas or in areas that have been disturbed by people in the past. And so that you have all these patches at the zoo, I've done a little work documenting pollinators in some of my little habitat restoration areas. And I have been trying to learn the bees, but my surveys are not very rigorous or systematic. How do you do a professional survey of bees?
These are being a lot of controversy in this time because some people using like big database and then don't know the biology or history of the bees and then try to compare what is going on with the bees. A paper just came out and there is people discussing about because this paper, they claim the diversity is decreasing in time. Probably it's true, but how they use the big database to compare, they be errors because now we have less people collecting like in the past, and we have less people dedicated expert in some groups, and that can be a misleading information. The surveys, in general, we will try to do some groups. It's hard to have manage big diversity groups. But in my case, what I do is I collect the bees. I do like the old-fashioned way, go with my net, and try to look for the focal plants, check the phenology of the different plants flowering at the time. I collect the bees, then I put it in a sample when I pin it, and then in the lab, I try to identify it in the microscope.
Are you able to do bee identification without collecting and looking at under the microscope, or is it impossible to be able to, like, say, take a picture and know what species you're looking at?
That is another controversial point. In most of the cases, yeah, we can identify some bees, but in other cases, we cannot. It's like, for example, if you take a picture of someone you know, and sometimes you have a different angle of that same person, you can say, oh, you look totally different.
Oh, yeah.
And that happened in many cases with bees. But in some cases, the ones that are more easy to identify because there are some characters, we can identify it, but by pictures, we can identify it. But there is another group we cannot because we need different angles, or we need to check some characters that are not easy to see because the bees, they have so many hairs, and then we need to remove the hair for looking that character. There is a lot of identification with bumblebees. Bumblebees, we know a lot of bumblebees, but at the same time, there are species that are really close together and they look similar. And one, the shape of the head or the position of the little eyes, ocelli, make it the difference between one species and another species close related. I mentioned this is kind of controversial because 4 years ago, or maybe 5, there was people, they identified a new species. This was in Africa. I think it was a carpenter bee. By a picture, they identify as a new species.
Oh, so they didn't have the species in hand or like a specimen?
Yeah, they don't have the species on hand. And probably, I didn't follow up, but probably was a new species. But when we do this, we have some protocols. We need these samples for putting in museums. We create the type. We put these types in different museums, and they have a protocol for describing a species. And then you put the paper, and that scientific name became something official. In that case, they use the
Just
picture.
A quick note
they
about
create
this
a lot of
term
controversy.
that Jose uses, type. A type specimen is actually the physical organism that was used as the reference for when a new species is named. The official description of the newly named species is based on the physical characteristics of this type specimen. These type specimens are collected and deposited in museum collections, or in the case of plants, an herbarium. So you can see why it's controversial among taxonomists, the people who catalog and name organisms, that there were no specimens collected, but only photographs taken.
2 years ago, there was a really bad problem in Brazil. The museum, the National History Museum on Brazil got on fire, and most of these species, like the samples, they disappear forever. And now they need to create the new types. I'm a person who uses pictures a lot. I have a project, is citizen science based, and we are identifying, tracking bumblebees in Chile. And this is because I'm here in the United States, but I still need to work in Chile, and the citizen science worked perfect for me because people is taking the pictures of these bumblebees and we can track it. And in this case, my bumblebees work perfect for me because the native one is the giant bumblebee. It's from South America. It's now really in endangered. It's orange and is the biggest bumblebee in the world, 1.5 inches probably. And compared with the introduced ones, they are more like the striped yellow and white. And then with pictures, I can compare and tracking, and then I do maps for the introduced ones, check how much is spreading in South America, and with the native one, I see how this species is shrinking. And I use a lot of pictures. I'm a user of pictures of bees. 2-3 years ago, we have some pictures of bees. And I know native bees from Chile. And someone sent me this picture of bee, and I told them, this is not a bee from Chile. And then I sent another friend to collect the bee, and then he sent it to me and I identify it. We start identifying introduced species, but based on citizen science. The first record was pictures, and then the other person went to the place and collect the bee, and then we identify it as a introduced species. We have like 3 or 4 identified like that way, based in citizen science.
Yeah, so we're doing something similar with plants too through the iNaturalist, and we use iNaturalist, the citizen science app, because it collects pictures by citizen scientists. And Amy Buteau, our botanist, and I are finding people that are making observations of things that hadn't been recorded in the state before. And so sometimes it's difficult to tell if that's truly a new species or an exotic species in the area, and then going out and verifying or collecting the actual plant from the wild. And so it sounds like you are doing something similar. Somebody submits a photograph, then a biologist goes out and verifies that that truly is something new. That's interesting that something similar is going on with the bees in Chile. You collect species or specimens, and you mentioned how important they are for a kind of scientific study, making sure that we know that when we're finding a new species, it truly is a new species, and keeping those records at museums. What are you doing with the specimens that you collect for your projects, like at the zoo? Do they go into a collection that the zoo keeps?
Actually, we still have it in the lab, and we are still working in identifying two-level species. At the moment, we are putting it here in East Central. East Central have a collection. We are thinking in donate half of the identified species to the collection of the Sam Noble Museum. How I mentioned before, Oklahoma need to have a repository of their species and identify it when we do this future generation, know what we have here.
And like we saw with the Brazil Museum, you want to make sure that you have duplicates in different locations so that if something happens to one collection, there's a duplicate somewhere else.
Yeah, how you was mentioned too about BioBlitz, I want to mention there is one person, probably one of the most important bee person in the world. probably one of the top person identifying a species in iNaturalist, Dr. John Asher. He identified, I don't know how many he said was an insane number.
Right.
Yeah, last year they published a paper all based in iNaturalist database. And this paper was about the distribution of all the bees around the world using iNaturalist. I like the citizen science project because they can allow us have some information. If only scientists doing it, we have a fraction of that information.
Right.
Coming back to my story with my bumblebees in Chile, we have all the history of the native bumblebee. I think in 200 years of history of people collecting this bee, we have 1,000 records. With the citizen science, in 6 years, we have like 3,000 records for the same species. Most of the records was regions not recorded before, because if we get the history of people collecting bees in Chile, probably was like 10 entomologists in total, and they went to the same places most of the time. In the case of the citizen science, you can have people living in rural parts, or they go vacation, or they go to hike in the wild and take the picture. You have records was not allowed before, because scientists don't have the resources to go all these places.
Right. That's something we've hit on several times in the podcast. And you mentioned earlier that there's just not enough people doing basic survey work to add information. Well, there are not enough professional biologists able to do survey work to add to the information. But these citizen science projects like iNaturalist that use apps on your phone, it's been an amazing increase in data that we've been able to collect about the biogeography of species all across the state. And people don't realize, they think that we're kind of beyond the science where we know where everything is and we have found everything. But even in Oklahoma, we're still learning things about the distribution of species and the seasonality of species. I would think that that's similar with plants and lots of insects. There's just has not been as much information. And like you mentioned, Oklahoma has been kind of empty with respect to bee research. There hasn't been a whole bunch done.
Yeah, here in Oklahoma, we have the more updated information is from the Oklahoma State University. They have a list, like a checklist of bees of Oklahoma, and that number is around 200 species. And when we compare probably the size of Oklahoma and compare it with neighbor states, for example, Kansas have around 500 species.
Oh, wow. And they're not even as diverse, like ecoregion wise.
Yeah, Missouri have like 500. Texas, and south of us, they have 1,100 species of bees. And how you mentioned, we always talk about Oklahoma, we are in a crossroads. Here we can find species from Kansas, Missouri, for the cross timbers. We have in the south, the species are more related to Texas. And if we go to the Panhandle, that is really interesting. I want to go there because if you have all the influence of the Rockies, if you have more plants, you have more diversity of bees. Probably it's a hot spot over there.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about the Panhandle being a hot spot for bees. Have you been able to go out there and do any work yet?
Not yet, but it's in my bucket list. Here in Oklahoma, we have a lot of clay, and we have a lot of these bees. They love clay because they make their nest.
Oh, like in the clay soil?
Yeah, they love this kind of soil. And there are some chimney bees. In some other part of the country, you can see these bees make it like in clay walls, make aggregations like thousands of these bees, nesting areas. At the zoo, this bee was the more common. And I was always trying to look where they make the nest because it's kind of impressive. Because they make the holes even in walls. Like if you have a dovey house, sometimes they make holes in there.
Oh.
They go and pick water and use the clay for create like this chimney, kind of little tubes. And you can see it all coming out and coming in these tubes.
Did you find them at the zoo?
No, I didn't, but I see the bee. It was so common. Probably in early summer was the more common bee, native bee in the area. And I was looking because here in Oklahoma, we have a lot of these places with clay, and then it's perfect for them for making the nest. And other place really I want to look is the dunes. We have the Little Sahara,
Oh, yeah.
and we have a species they love sun. They're associated with the flowers in the sand areas, but they are crazy making in sandy areas. And that is crazy because when you see the sun, they can get really hot, especially in the middle of the day. These bees, they have like really long hairs. They look like fluffy, like little teddy bears of bees.
Yeah, but they're not bumblebees.
There are no bumblebees. Yeah, there are other in the same family are some in the group, but there is no bumblebees. And they are fluffy, and they use these long hairs for jump in the sun, in the hot sun, and then don't get burned. It's like a coat for the hot sun, and then some way they identify where is their nest. You see flat sun, but they jump and like swim in the sun, and then look for the nest.
Oh.
People study some of these kind of bees because not many was studied where they look, and they are associated with sandy areas, and some are associated with like sandy rocks and make nests over there. And there are people looking at now, oh, they are distributed over here. And I think there is people not yet study in these sandy areas over here. We have this Little Sahara, what is interesting flowers, that bees pollinate that flowers.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Like how I mentioned before, they know where they need to look for where is the hole. But if you see the loose sun, you cannot see the nest in the sand. And this is kind of an strategy. Many of bees, they have parasites, even other bees, parasite bees. And these bees, how they go in the sun and their nest kind of hiding in this loose sand, they don't have too many parasites.
Comes up to a point that I wanted to make since we're talking about bees is that a lot of people, when they think of bees, the quintessential bee that they think of is the honeybee, and they think of that as being kind of a typical bee, when really the life history of a honeybee is really unusual compared to most bee species. Most bees don't make hives with hundreds and hundreds of worker bees, and most make very small nests that the individual female bee provisions the nests on their own. So maybe you could talk a little bit about these solitary bees and the kind of parasite problem that they might have. Like these cuckoo bees are super cool, and I don't think a lot of people have heard about them.
Yeah, in general, when we think about bees, there are probably 90% that are solitaries. That means only one mom, and they do it alone. They make the nest, clean the nest, go for the pollen and nectar. Only a few percentage of bees, they have more colonies. The more close are bumblebees when they have a queen and some workers and drones. The numbers of the colony of bumblebees are around 200 individuals. When you compare to the honeybee, they can get to the 50,000 of individuals. In general, most of the bees, they're alone, but at the same time, they try to aggregate and they get these nets close to each other. Some of these, they can have huge aggregation, but they are still having their own house. Colonies, they have some of the workers, they're taking care. The workers, they cannot have babies. They are sterile compared to the queen. And these workers, they can have care of the nest. In the case when there are solitaries, when the mom go out, the nest get alone. And when they get alone, there is the possibility of having more parasites. They have different kind of parasites. They can be flies, beetles. There is one group that are called the kleptoparasites. And the kleptoparasites, in the case of the bees, there are other bees parasiting bees. What they do, or the cuckoo bees, when the mom go out for looking the pollen and nectar, these cuckoo bees, they go to the nest and put their own egg in the nest of the other bee. And then this egg developed faster than the host. And then when the larvae came out, they have these huge mandibles and kill the host. And then they develop the parasite bee in the nest and taking the resource.
Yeah, so they steal the resources that the original bee provisioned for its young.
In bees, this is really common. You have complete groups of bees. In the family of the honeybee, Apidae, you have a subfamily completely cuckoo bees. In general, most of the families of bees, we have like 7 families. In the United States, we have 5 families of bees. Of these 5 families, in 4 of them, you can find cuckoo bees.
Yeah, it must be a good evolutionary strategy to have somebody else feed your babies for you.
Yeah, for us, like ecologists, we don't think like in this way of they're stealing some other. For our view, there are indicators. In the scale of the food chain, you need to have a good population of the host, maintain the cuckoo bees. If you found cuckoo bees in the environment, you can know the environment is healthy, maintaining the host and maintaining the cuckoo bees.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way. Exciting to know that if we see cuckoo bees, that means there's healthy other species too.
That was an interesting point when we was looking in the Oklahoma City Zoo. We found at least 7 species of cuckoo bees, and that means there's a kind of a healthy environment of resources because they can maintain the host. And if you have a good population of hosts, you can maintain the good population of the cuckoo bees.
So you have been doing research on bees in Oklahoma and then in Chile, of course. And how did you get interested in bees to begin with? Have you always been interested as like a little kid? Is it something that you've picked up more as you learned to be a biologist later?
Actually, I was not interested in bees at all, but I was always interested in nature. I grew up by the ocean and by the forest. I'm from Chile and the Mediterranean area. Our environment is not diverse like other countries in South America, but it's unique. Our proportion of endemism is really high.
That you might not have heard before, endemism. Ecologists say that a region has high endemism when that area has lots of species that are unique to the region and don't occur elsewhere. Endemism is high in areas that are isolated or distinctly different from their surrounding areas. Chile has high endemism because of the geography that isolates habitats. On the other hand, Oklahoma, while being highly diverse, has low levels of endemism because our habitats are not isolated and we share ecoregions with all of our surrounding states.
Then I was like really involved, like these little kids that are collecting frogs or snakes. Once I get a dead snake, like probably was like 10 years old, and I take the snake and I put it in a container and I put it in a freezer, and then the next day my mommy was screaming because they opened the freezer and I found, and I was like that kind of kid. Like I was always interested in going to the forest and checking the birds. For this reason, I went to college, study biology. When I was in biology, I started doing invertebrates, but marine invertebrates. I was on the team of free diving. That is one sport we practice, especially in my college.
Oh, really? Free diving in the ocean?
Yeah, we free dive, and when we start, we do this collecting invertebrates. We have like a seeker. They give you a number of species, and you need to come back with that number of species in less time, and then the first person we come back with the species, they get the prize.
Uh-huh.
I was really good in that, and I remember the names of the species, and I was like really good. At first, it was really interesting in the ocean life. Then I was starting doing the entomology class. I have a professor that became my advisor for my undergraduate. She told me, oh, look, come and work with us. We work with bees. Why bees? I was thinking like bees. Then I went to the lab and opened the box, the first box, and then I discovered these crazy color shapes. And Chile, again, we don't have a huge diversity, but we have a huge endemism. We are a hot spot of bee diversity.
Oh, okay.
There was many famous bee person that came to Chile because they want to study this crazy diversity, and I met some really important people. Coming back again, and Kansas here in the United States was the epicenter of the bee people because there was a scientist. He was Dr. Michener. He have a book. It's called Bees of the World. It's our Bible. They have all the information of all the bees in the world. My advisor, Dr. Luisa Ruz, she did her studies here with Michener in the 80s, 90s. When she come back to there, all the people, here was all the students, all the famous people studying bees was their classmates. and then they go to Chile. And I met so many people who study bees because this connection. And then I get into the bees. I open the first drawer and I see these crazy bees, and then study bees forever. And I love it now. Every place I go, I found these diversities, some species. I saw it in books, and now I see it in real life.
So you said you ended up in Oklahoma because your wife got a position at East Central?
Yep.
I noticed, because I'm one of your social media followers, that I see you and your family travel around the state a lot doing camping and canoeing. What have been some of your favorite places in Oklahoma to explore?
Before moving here to Oklahoma, I live in Wisconsin. I live in North Carolina in the Appalachian area, and in California. When I moved from Chile to California, was not so many different. The weather, climate, and the environment is similar, this Mediterranean region. Then I moved to the Appalachian, and that was different and was so pretty. Then I moved to the Wisconsin, and I never have so crazy winters, and I love it. When I grew up, I almost didn't have snow. Never have snow in my hometown. The first time I get to the snow when I went to the mountains, and I probably was 20. For me, having snow was crazy. It's like this child, they imagine Christmas with the snow. We grew up in the South Hemisphere. We have Santa Claus still with the coat, but it's summer and hot. We throw like fake snow. Having snow is like this is child dream of Christmas. I was having a really good time. And then we will move to Oklahoma. And I was thinking Oklahoma. I was thinking more like kind of Texas vibe, or Arizona. Like I was imagining Oklahoma like flat and desert. And then I moved here and wow, there is a lot of forest. And then we like to do kayak, and there is so many places when we do kayaking here. We like to go camping in the east border when it's close to Arkansas, and then they have all these pretty forests, and then we go. Oklahoma have 11 ecoregions, and that is so unique. In a couple hours, you can do all these and find the different environments. I love having the outdoors in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that Oklahoma is so diverse, and that even some people who grow up here. I grew up somewhere else, and when I wasn't even planning to move to Oklahoma, but I met somebody from Oklahoma, and she told me she studied forests, and I would just laughed at her because I assumed that she was just joking because I didn't think Oklahoma had any forests in it. I thought it was just grasslands. And then, of course, I came for graduate school and realized like how diverse it is, and how, like you said, how many ecoregions we span from all the way from the Gulf coastal plain in the very southeastern tip out to the Panhandle, where you said it has a lot of Rocky Mountain influences with ponderosa pine and pinyon pine. Yeah, Oklahoma is really exciting biodiversity-wise, and that's one of the reasons why I've been able to explore with BioBlitz and the activities that we've been doing. It's been a lot of fun to do adventures across the state.
We love it. I have two daughters. We try to do as much as we can outdoors. They are collecting the passport. They have the state parks.
Oh, yeah.
And they are collecting the stamp for their passports, and we want to, as soon as possible, finish that passport. And we do the national forest too. There are so many great places to explore here.
We'll move on to our quick question round that you can answer these questions with short answers or long answers, but it's just kind of a fun little thing I like to do with most of the people at the end of the Meet the Expert podcast. What is one of your most memorable days in the field?
I was talking this the other day with my wife. We was working in Chile again. We was working in plants in high elevation, 3,000 meters, that is around 9,000, 10,000 feet over the level of the sea with cushion plants. And I was looking for pollination in that plant. And every day we need to travel. It was not a huge distance, but how you need to go up in the mountains, it take like 2 hours driving. And one day, our dog gets sick, probably because the day before he was eating a carcass on the field. Mm-hmm. He gets sick and he pooped all over me. We was just arriving to the place, and and I was all poop over. I didn't have a changing clothes. I never take clothes to change. My wife, I say, I need to go back home. And she say, no, we're here. We already drive. And we need to take the measures. And then I was in the mountains. I was collecting bees too. I was running in the mountains in underwear, all that. Now I remember it's funny. At that moment was not.
Right. No, probably not. You probably didn't have like a whole bunch of extra water either to like wash off.
No, but I think I washed up because on the top of the mountain it still came like little streams of water. The snow day. I think I get clean, but I will not put again these clothes even if I kind of rinse it off. Was too much.
Yeah. Oh, that's a unique story. Question number 2, what has been the most exciting organism that you have seen in the wild?
I was in entomology class and I was doing my homework. I need to do like insectarium. And I was with a friend and I was like, oh, look at that. And then we saw a giant dragonfly. We have in Chile the giant dragonfly. And I saw it. I'd read about that species. And I was like crazy. And I jumped over with my net and I just landed on top of a thorny plant. But I was so happy because I catch it. And then I was like so crazy. But talking about this, I was talking with my wife again about these Lazarus species, that idea of you can find something, you consider it disappear forever. The example of the ginkgo bilobas or the down tree or the silicon. And I always remember this image of Jurassic Park when these scientists, they look at the dinosaurs and they get like crazy because there are something that are working all their life and they see it in the field. I thinking that is my like dream. Finding something is you are looking forever and then you found it. Probably that sensation of finding something is so unique, like finding the unicorn. I was thinking about this sensation of finding that species is like so special.
So how big is the giant dragonfly?
The giant dragonfly is 20 centimeters, like 8 inches. Comparative, like a normal dragonfly, like the one we found here. This one is a little 1.5 bigger, but it's bulky too. It's like a dragonfly with muscles.
Okay, question number 3. What advice would you give someone wanting to become an expert or at least learn more about bees?
Love what you do. It's this idea of like Pokemon. I think the guy who invented Pokemon was an entomologist. You love your stuff and you go in and collect it, and then you have this sensation. You got a new one, and every time you find a new one, you feel more happy about. Learning about that, like you learn about Pikachu and you get into know more the species. I think that is the most moved me when I study not only bees, in general, all the natural history. It's like trying to know more about that species and know more about the local. Talking about this idea of the citizen science, I didn't mention before, but it's kind of unique. When we was doing the citizen science project and started studying this bumblebee, there was a lot of people talking me about their experience with the bumblebee, the giant bumblebee. These people start talking, when I was a child, I went with my grandpa and grandma and collect honey. And that was curious because we don't have, in our reference of the people who study bumblebees, there was not records about people collecting honey from bumblebees. And then we started investigating, and that was true. There was the native people from Chile, they used the honey from the bumblebees and then use it as a medicine. They considered the bumblebee as a goddess. There was all this relation. They was kind of forgotten in the history, and we discovered it by citizen science. And it was unique. And we published an article about that, and people start kind of rescue these histories. They just was published like last year, and this year, 2 groups, they create some plays, and then start telling this story in schools. And that It's like something when you work for your investigation and then pass to other disciplines, they make you feel really happy. You're not only teaching them, they can teach you back. And that is something unique when I'm doing citizen science.
Getting stories and histories like that, that's really fascinating. When I talk to landowners or people in Oklahoma, there's lots of stories about, things they used to see and they don't see any longer, even though it's not scientific data that was collected by, a biologist. That's good information about where things used to occur and don't occur anymore. One of the more common things that people talk about is the Texas horned lizard or the horny toad. There's lots of anecdotal evidence from people who have grown up in the state about how it's declined over the years. And we wouldn't have that information unless people paid attention. It's a very charismatic species and people loved it. And now we don't see it as much and people remark on that. What is on your natural history bucket list?
I mentioned before we like to do kayaking and stand-up paddle. I have this idea of like going to Florida and do stand-up paddle where there is the manatees.
Oh, yeah.
One of these unique species. Yeah, I think that is in my long-term bucket list. Like the one I want to do soon is going to the Panhandle and check the bees over there. Especially because I mentioned before, historically, we have like 10 species of bumblebees. But I think in that area of the Panhandle, for all these influence of the Rockies, we can find more species of bumblebees, add more species of the Oklahoma list of bumblebees, because bumblebees in general, they like these areas, especially mountain, cold associations. And I think we can find at least 3 or 4 new species that are not recorded for Oklahoma, and we can find it in that area.
I read recently all about bumblebees, and the reason why they're fuzzy is because they're adapted to colder climates.
Yeah, there is another person who studied a lot of bumblebees, Dr. Williams from the London Museum. He do the genetic and the story of the bumblebees, and all they originate in China and in that area in the Himalaya region. And that is the other reason why we jokingly call it the pandas of the bee world.
Yeah.
Originate in that area, colder climate, and then start moving. And if you go to the parts where it's less cold and more warm, they are not so diverse. But they believe the center of origin of all the bumblebees is the Himalayan region.
Okay, last question. What is the next thing you want to learn about?
I like to learn a lot, like many stuff. I'm from a different country and we moved to here. The Super Bowl is coming soon. I love football now. And I love other sports. I learned here. I love learning. But one you mentioned, and it was funny, is like a ukulele. My wife, they gave me a ukulele for Christmas, and I learned it. Because I mentioned before, we camp a lot, and we say, we need some kind of music when we're doing here around the fire, especially because I want my daughter singing.
Uh-huh.
I'm now learning to play ukulele.
Well, that's a good instrument for camping because it's kind of small.
Yeah, it's kind of easy to learn. There is not so many complicated finger positions. I am still learning, but I think soon we'll play my first song.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Jose, for taking the time to talk to me about bees and all of your research that you have been doing here in Oklahoma and your citizen science work in Chile. Everything was really fascinating. I look forward to working with you in the future and learning more about bees from you.
Yeah, no, thank you for inviting me. I told you before, I'm a fan of the podcast. I listen many of them. Secretly, don't tell the bees, I'm a herpetologist, and I like this idea. I never see a salamander. Probably that is in my list too. We don't have that in Chile, and I didn't found it one here yet.
Oh, did you listen to the one about Jessa?
Yes, I was. She told northeast, and sometimes we travel over there. I need to look that area for finding the salamanders walking around. I need to check it out. And I love snakes, and here in Oklahoma, they have so many pretty snakes.
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much for all your time today.
Oh, thank you. No, I have a really good time talking about bees.
I learn so much about bee biology from Jose every time we talk. You can read more about his work on his website and follow him on Twitter. The links are in the show notes. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen so you are notified when we upload more episodes. We would love to have your feedback about the podcast. You can leave a review where you subscribe. You can also send us a Facebook message or tweet at us or simply email your comments to me at prill@ou.edu. This podcast is a project of Oklahoma State Parks and BioBlitz Oklahoma, an outreach program of the Oklahoma Biological Survey at the University of Oklahoma. We hope that you have time to step outside today and explore Oklahoma's amazing biodiversity. Or maybe this week you could just watch from your window. Remember, you can find biodiversity right outside your own door.